Language learning to happen, meaning has to be there. So when you or the students are saying something, when they're seeing text, when they're hearing language production, if the meaning isn't there, it's going to be pretty much meaningless. So you have to create meaning, and you have to connect the meaning with the words that they're seeing or hearing or saying. If I have a pen and I say pen, and I have them say pen, and so they see this object, they hear the sound, they produce the sound, all of that is connecting that meaning with this object that they can see. And that's helpful. And so their brain is starting to connect those things. So you have to constantly make sure that meaning is present.
Salut mes amis, this is Felipe from Lingucast. Today we got a very special guest, Dr. Hartshorn. How are you?
Good. Thanks for inviting me, Felipe.
Dr. Hartshorn is an ESL teacher and he does research on that. And we're going to ask him about the world of English learning, more specifically, in how people learn English, the importance of English as a world lingua franca, in how, I'll say it's probably the most learned language in the world. Is that correct?
I think so.
You think so?
As a second language.
As a second language.
There's probably about 400 million people that speak English as a first language and 1.5 billion that speak it as a second language. So really, when we talk about English, most of the speakers of English are using English as a second language.
And do you think that creates a lot of variation in English?
Oh, sure. Yeah. In the old days, long time ago, we used to think of English as one thing, unitary thing, and the native speakers spoke English, and people tried to be like native speakers. But now we realize, especially with English as a lingua franca, that there are lots of varieties of English. And the native speakers, even within a country like the United States, differ a little bit from the UK, from Australia, from New Zealand, Canada, and across regions of those countries. There's a lot of variation. But of course, there's even more variation where people use English to communicate as a lingua franca, and they don't worry about some of the things that typically people would worry about when they're thinking, oh, I have to speak standard English. So there's a lot of variation with grammar, vocabulary that varies, and it's perfectly acceptable in those contexts. So yeah, lots and lots of variety.
Can you tell us a little bit about these variations? And I heard that there's such thing as Singaporean English, Indian English, Chicano English that normally we would consider foreign, but now they're native speakers that speak that.
Yeah, and that's not exactly my area. I mostly focus on teaching, but even in the teaching context, we try to help teachers understand, especially teachers that are teaching people that don't need to sound like a quote-unquote native speaker, that it's okay to use English in a little bit different way. So when you look at different varieties of English, you have clearly different vocabulary, you have different pronunciation, and in some cases we might think, wow, that's really hard to understand or whatever, but in certain contexts it's perfectly appropriate, and the point is they communicate effectively, and so they're successfully using English. But there's also syntactic differences where you might simplify the grammar compared to what we would say in standard English in different ways. And that's not only in terms of a lingua franca, but you see that in the United States with inner city English, with Chicano English, where, you have native speakers. And so there's simplifications of the language that, someone hears that, and they think, well, that's not standard English, but it is their dialect that they've learned and they use. And in a lot of cases, people change registers, right?
Yes.
Or they can change dialects. And so in a lot of cases, people can speak inner city English perfectly appropriately in those contexts, and then turn around and use standard English in a different context. And so they can switch in many cases very successfully. So lots of varieties of English. And so that's something that we stress as we prepare teachers, especially teachers that will go abroad and teach English in contexts where they don't have to sound like a quote-unquote native speaker to be successful. They have to communicate effectively. And so the focus might be a little bit different in terms of what the expectations are, what you spend time teaching and practicing. You may not worry about certain aspects of pronunciation or certain aspects of grammatical structures because the focus is communicating.
It's it's definitely the point, communicating. I've seen that in job postings in for some Gulf countries and for Japan and Korea. I've seen that I might be wrong, but I've seen some countries saying we specifically want native English speakers from these countries, and apparently they're all lists of, I'll say, Anglo-speaking countries, but it doesn't keep someone from South Africa or from Nigeria to teach as well.
Yeah, that's really true. I think, yeah, typically you see that in the Middle East and in Asia, where it's kind of a tricky thing because there are pros and cons to being a native speaker. Native speakers typically have good pronunciation and there's some benefits, but non-native speakers or multi-competent language users, sometimes we use that term for teachers that are great teachers. Sometimes they come with better understanding of the language. So just because you're a native speaker doesn't mean you're a good teacher. And so it's kind of a myth that you really need a native speaker. In some cases, you have a non-native speaker or someone that learned the language as a second language learner that actually is a much better teacher. They understand the language better. They can relate to the students better because the students are on the same journey that they've been on, so they can help the students in a lot of ways. In some cases, you might have some benefits at the lower proficiency levels to actually have a non-native speaker teacher that really understands that journey. And then in some cases, as you get into higher proficiency levels, if you're really focused on aspects of pronunciation, there could be a benefit to having a native speaker. But I think it's great to have all kinds of English in your environment and different kinds of teachers because it helps you have a well-rounded experience in your learning.
And can you tell me what makes a good ESL teacher?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my thinking, the job of a language teacher is to promote or facilitate language development. And so there are a lot of things that teachers do and can do, but what will really make a difference to achieve that job, that goal, is facilitating activities where the language is being used in authentic ways. And when there's meaning present and the language is being used, it sticks in the brain a lot better. So if you're starting to learn vocabulary or syntactic structures and you start using those in real ways, it sticks. And so a really good language teacher isn't necessarily going to get up at the board and talk about how grammar works. They're going to, that's important. People need to learn vocabulary and they need to learn how syntax works in a language. But more importantly, perhaps, is the opportunities that they create to practice the language, to use the language in authentic ways. That's going to make a difference. When that's happening, language is developed. When that's not happening, there's a big difference between knowing about a language and being able to use the language. And so in some classes, you have a teacher gets up at the board and they talk about grammar, or they talk about this is how the language works. And so the students begin to learn about the language. But that doesn't mean they can use the language. The teacher then needs to go into a mode where they're practicing, where they're using the language. And ideally, they'll do something that we would call psychologically authentic. So, you could go to the store and you could literally buy things at the store or interact with, the clerk at the store, and that would be real. You can also do things like that in the classroom where you're interacting with realia or things and you're actually having exchanges, interactions, questions and answers that are psychologically authentic, even if you're not really at the store. But those kinds of exchanges will help language develop. So it's much more important to do something with the language, to use the language, to practice the language, than to just learn about the language.
Yeah, I personally had experiences where, for example, I think in every country, probably most countries, you'd learn English as a second language in school. In my case, I remember that most of my teachers were Brazilian, and the focus was more. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but their curriculum developed from teaching Latin, and normally you don't use Latin as in to speak. You use Latin to read or to understand church liturgy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, in a lot of contexts where people are supposedly quote unquote teaching language, they're learning about the language. Maybe they're translating, grammar translation. That really, it's useful to learn about a language. but that's not going to help you actually learn the language and be able to do something with the language. So what I would encourage teachers to do is set that method aside. And obviously we want to learn vocabulary, we want to learn structures, but we want to be using the language. So create activities where you're asking questions and you're answering questions that are real, either about your own lives or you're creating a context where you're trying to do something. There's task-based learning where you're actually going to try to accomplish something. So, and maybe some of this would only work at higher proficiency levels, but let's say that you're going to do a service project in the community. And so you need to talk to each other to figure out what the need is. You plan it, you talk to people in the community. And so you go through this whole process of using the language to accomplish something. And in that process, you develop language, you learn. But that's really different than learning about it. So you've got to have an active, productive experience with the language to really have it develop.
And I have a question to go on with that. Let's say it's my first day as an ESL teacher. I've never done that before. I have a more or less, I know how to teach about the language, and now I'm going to teach the usage of the language. How does a ESL teacher go into a classroom? How do they start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think way before you get to the first day, there are lots of questions that you need to have answered. And typically in a school, they will have these answers, but they may not. So if you're walking into a situation where you don't know anything about the learners, I think you need to understand, okay, who are the learners? Where are they coming from? What's their educational background? What do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do with the language? If someone, English is the language of flight. Airline pilots all over the world speak English. And so are they going to be flying an airplane? Or are they trying to get into a university? Are they trying to learn English to run specialized equipment in a factory? So you have to know what is it that they need to learn, what vocabulary, what linguistic patterns do they need to learn to be successful, because that makes all the difference in the world. So really analyzing and understanding the students, who they are, why they're here, what kind of English they need to know is a really important thing to build the framework for first. And then the next steps, you start develop a curriculum. We like to work backwards. So let's say that they need to be able to do these kinds of things with English. Well, how do we get there? Well, you step back and say, well, they need to do these to be able to do these things. Well, how do we do that? And so you design a curriculum that basically takes you from not knowing English all the way to where you can actually use the language in these specific ways that are intended for those learners.
In one of our interviews, we interviewed Dr. Kirk Belknap, and I remember he was talking about how the focus is always learning on specific situations and then building on that, expanding on a situation where you're competent or you're used to talking about your interests, and then you expand on that, and then you get more and more vocabulary. So that a little bit how you doing?
Yes, I think definitely. Yeah, you want to build. You want to start incrementally, even within a class period. A good teacher is going to break up what you're doing into little pieces. There's something called cognitive load, and as learners, we can only process so much at a time. If the teacher's expecting the student to do more than they can actually do, it's not going to go well. So the teacher's job is to sort of take a bite-sized piece of learning and help them learn that much, and then build on it and continue to build on it throughout the class period. So they're doing more and more and more with more vocabulary, more grammar, whatever, and it builds to where they're doing something much more complex than they could do at the beginning. And then you multiply that day after day, week after week, month after month, and you end up with a really changed language ability.
Here's a question that's always been in the back of my mind when it comes to English teaching. A lot of times, I think always, there are advantages and disadvantages in the learner's perspective. Objectively, Spanish learner has greater advantage in learning English due to the similarity of Spanish and English than a Mandarin Chinese speaker or Korean speaker. How does a language teacher try to balance these things?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I think ultimately, if you had a homogeneous group of learners, that would be a little bit more efficient, because you could leverage the fact that they're all similar. They're going to have similar questions, similar transfer from their first language, maybe similar issues with pronunciation, especially at the lower levels. That can be more efficient. But there's some real advantages to working with a wide group of people because they hear different kinds of English. They learn cultural things that are really important for them to learn from their classmates. Ultimately, there's something we call language distance or linguistic distance. And so English will be a little bit more similar to Spanish and Italian and French and German and more distant from Chinese, Arabic, Korean. And so inherently, it's going to take, for example, a native speaker of Chinese probably a little longer to learn English than it will someone that speaks Spanish. But that doesn't necessarily need to mean that, they're going to really struggle. It just means that it's going to take a little bit longer because those languages are more different. But having a classroom of different learners can actually be really helpful. And typically, everyone comes with their L1, and their L1 is going to bring some benefits. I mean, here's just some examples. So, with Chinese, you have, same linguistic syntactic pattern as English, even though the pronunciation is going to be wildly different. The orthography is going to be wildly different. But so there will be things that will be a little easier or a little more difficult, and they kind of balance out. So ultimately, it gets down to how motivated is the learner, and if the teacher can create opportunities for language development. I think a learner doesn't have to say, the language distance here is so big, it's going to be a really big journey for me. It's going to be more difficult. I mean, that may be true a little bit, but if you just jump in and start practicing, start using the language the best you can, you're gonna make great progress.
I've taught ESL before, but most of my students were of Latin American background, Portuguese, Spanish. Like you said, this group has certain advantages, and I can build I built a curriculum to attend those needs. How would I start with a native Mandarin Chinese learner?
Yeah, and there's some cultural differences too that may come into play.
Exactly.
So, for example, it's very common for some Asian learners, and particularly like Japanese learners and maybe Korean learners too, to be a little more quiet, a little more reticent, hesitant, where the students that I've seen that actually are the most outgoing and gregarious are from Brazil, for example. So they're just happy and they interact with each other. Those are actually really good things for the language learning classroom. If people need to participate, they need to be engaged. So one thing I try to do is if I'm working with, for example, and I don't want to overly stereotype people because not everyone's the same, but more often than not, you'll find patterns in behavior. So when I'm working with Japanese students, for example, I try to say, okay, what we're going to do in this classroom might be a little bit different than you expect. And you might feel a little uncomfortable, but we're going to be very interactive. We're going to talk a lot. I'm going to ask you questions. So we're going to be interacting a lot. So I'm asking you to step outside of your cultural bubble and engage in this learning process with me. And so for some students that might be kind of hard. For others, it's really easy. But the students that are very interactive are going to learn more.
Of course. And I've seen that with missionaries. The missionaries who tend to be more, say, less scared of making mistakes, more outgoing, they tended to get a better proficiency at a faster rate. And you taught in Japan, is that correct?
Yes.
Oh, did you learn a little about Japanese, or?
Yes. So I actually lived in Japan twice.
Huh?
And I taught at a university near Kumamoto, Japan. And there are some really nice efficiencies to teaching English or any language to a homogeneous group because you can leverage the things you know about their L1. And so it can be very helpful that way. So I taught homogeneous groups of Japanese in Japan, but also in the United States. I was the curriculum coordinator for the largest study abroad program between Japan and the United States, the Asia University America program. So it operated at Central Washington University, Eastern Washington University, and Western Washington University. And so we'd get groups of students for about half a year, and they would all be Japanese learners, Japanese speakers learning English. But because I knew Japanese and I knew what they would likely struggle with, I actually could teach much more efficiently, especially when it came to pronunciation. I could very efficiently help them overcome some of the pronunciation hurdles. And I knew that they were all going to be maybe a little more reticent to participate. So that was a focus. So yeah, it can be done, but sometimes you have to, this isn't the right word, but kind of reprogram them to learn in an environment that maybe is different from their cultural environment of learning. So when I taught in Japan, most of the professors would get up and lecture for an hour and a half, and that's it. And so there was no interaction really with the students. So I try to say, we're going to throw that to the side, and we're going to be very interactive here. I'm going to be asking you questions. We're going to be talking back and forth. We're going to have tasks that we're working on. We're going to be working with partners. And that kind of interaction is going to really help them develop their language. A lecture class, again, might help a little bit in learning about the language, but it's not going to help them learn the language.
For lower proficiency, so do you start speaking English right away like they do in the MTC, in the Missionary Training Center? Or the fact that you know Japanese it gives like, hey, we're gonna start Japanese right now. Which one is better in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think it depends on a lot of factors. So it's just not a one size fits all thing. Mm-hmm. I think it depends on who are your students, what do they already know, what's their background, and other things like how intelligent are they, and how motivated are they? Those are really important questions. If a learner is not super motivated or may struggle with, maybe they're not intelligent. I mean, that can happen. Someone can be sick or they can have an accident or something. So you just need to know, who are my students? Are they really good students? Are they mediocre students? Are they really motivated? Are they not so motivated? What kind of learning styles might they have? What kind of activities are they willing to engage in? So really learning about your students is so important because it's going to make a big difference. And then leveraging that, if you have what we call true beginners, you're starting from zero. You're starting from, and so that can be really challenging, and it takes a special skill set for a teacher to do that. I'm convinced that you don't need to speak the language of the learner necessarily. Mm-hmm. I mean, it can help. And I'm perfectly fine with, I know this is a controversial thing, I'm perfectly fine with some L1 in the language learning classroom if it helps learning. But some people say, you should never do that. But I think it's perfectly appropriate if it's going to facilitate learning. But you need to know kind of who your students are. And again, what are we trying to do with the English? Where are we ending up? Do they want to go to a university? Do they want to work in a hotel? Are they going to work in a factory? Are they going to fly an airplane? Are they going to be in the military? All of those things matter. It matters, how much, where you focus your time and energy. Are you mostly talking about listening and speaking? Do they need to learn how to read and write quickly as well? Like linguistics generally, I think of language primarily as listening and speaking. Mm-hmm. That's basically what language is. And then, of course, in some contexts, though, reading and writing become really important. In academics and professional contexts, that becomes really important too. So when you start with someone, we don't always know the answer, but when you start at the very beginning, knowing where they're headed, where they want to go, makes a difference because it impacts how much you do of different kinds of things to develop certain aspects of their language. And it shapes the direction you're going to go with the language.
Now you open a new door to what's that skill set that one needs to when teaching true beginners, especially given the linguistic distance?
Yeah, those are really good questions. For language learning to happen, meaning has to be there. So when you or the students are saying something, when they're seeing text, when they're hearing language production, if the meaning isn't there, it's going to be pretty much meaningless. So you have to create meaning, and you have to connect the meaning with the words that they're seeing or hearing or saying. So it would be meaningless for you to choral, say this word, say that word. But if you were creating meaning, so, if I have a pen and I say pen, and I have them say pen, and so they see this object, they hear the sound, they produce the sound. All of that is connecting that meaning with this object that they can see, and that's helpful. And so their brain is starting to connect those things. So you have to constantly make sure that meaning is present. So you can do that with what we call realia, things, items that you're using in the classroom. You can do it by body language. You can do it with images, but the meaning has to be there. And if you can create the meaning, then language learning can begin. If you're not creating enough meaning, it's going to be a really hard challenge. Other things that you would do as a teacher, you would slow your speech way down, and you might even kind of normal syntax and communicate with words, single words. when babies are born, they develop, they get to, a point where they say one word at a time and then a few words at a time. Some of that I think would be perfectly appropriate with true beginners because they're at the word level. Novice learners are going to be learning vocabulary, and helping them do that by creating meaning is going to make a difference. And of course, if they need to be learning to read and write at some point, depending on how important that is, you're going to be introducing the alphabet. You're going to start introducing the orthography. But that may come much later if the real focus immediately is listening and speaking.
Yeah, it's fascinating because normally we as teachers we want them to progress fast, right? And it can feel kind of frustrating working with a true beginner since okay, they're not progressing as fast as I wanted to. It's kind of worrying, and there's always that anxiety. How does one deal with that?
Yeah, those are all great questions. I think a good teacher is going to have people using the language in ways that they can immediately. So I don't think we need to wait. But again, if they're really low proficiency, we're talking about vocabulary. So having them use vocabulary, maybe I hold up a box and they say what it is. This is a box. This is a pen. This is a pencil. This is my shirt. This is my book. Chair. So I might be pointing to things and they're saying the words. So that's in a sense that's using the language at the level that they're at. And I think it's important for them to start using the language immediately because they will feel the excitement of learning when they start using the language. It's like, wow, I am using the language. If you go into a class and you're not using the language and you're learning about the language, that can be really frustrating for the learner. So I think it's really important for the teacher to say they're going to be using the language in appropriate ways in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes. We're going to be using the language in appropriate ways. But it takes some creativity to think of the kinds of tasks where they would do that. Again, it might be at the lowest level. You might just be saying vocabulary. If a little bit higher level, they might come into the classroom and you incrementally get them starting to use something. You might explain it for, we're going to work on this structure. We're going to use these vocabulary words to do these things. And the explanation is very brief, and then you start doing it. And they get feedback as they go. And then you take what you just did and you build on it.
Is there a difference in teaching children and adults? And is it true that, I believe it's not true based on my observation experience, but some people would believe that adults are not able to learn language as efficiently. Is that true? Or in your experience, how does it work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So generally speaking, for adults, it will be more difficult, especially when it comes to pronunciation. Pronunciation will typically be more challenging. It's, and this isn't important for everyone, but some learners want to sound like a native speaker. That journey will not happen for most people. They're not going to sound like a native speaker. And so they just need to know that up front, I think, sometimes. But older learners can learn language very well, but it's a little bit different experience. And now we talked about pronunciation. That's maybe a special case. If the learner is motivated enough, they can be a very good learner. But they also need time in the language. And so often what happens with adults is you may not have the same kind of inherent motivation that you have with children. And you also might have a context where they feel like they don't have the time. They do work and they've got family and they've got all these other commitments. And so if it's a foreign language context, for example, they might just say, I don't have time, or I don't have the opportunity. Or even if they go to a class, it's only an hour or so many hours per week or whatever. So, but if they were motivated, they were really eager to learn, they certainly could. There's research that shows that learners, adults, middle-aged adults, and even older adults can learn language very well if they're willing to spend the time doing it. So if they were to put themselves in a context where they had to use the language a lot, they would learn very well. But it will typically be a little bit more difficult. But there's kind of a balance there because with children are learning, they learn very quickly, but they don't have the cognitive depth and understanding that adults have. So adults can approach language learning with a lot more metacognition. They can be more strategic. They can say, okay, I'm going to learn these 20 words a day or whatever. I'm going to practice. I'm going to do these other things. So the advantage that children have, I think, can be real, but it can be compensated for by what adults have. Adults have all of this cognitive development that they can leverage then towards language development if that's something they're interested in doing. Now, sometimes people might say, "Oh, I can't learn it," because maybe they don't really want to. But if they want to, they certainly can. And so if someone's motivated and they're older, they're middle-aged or even older, an older learner, they can learn language really well, but they have to put in the time and energy to do it.
Yeah, I was talking exactly about this point with someone, with a student of mine, and I was like, look, you think that your son maybe speaks the language better, but have you thought about the fact that your son does not need to go through the same situations as you do? You need to go to Walmart and talk to a cashier. So he doesn't need to do that. He needs to only use the language to play with the friends. He's they're, I would say, stuck in certain domains. You, as an adult, you use language for more stuff. You know more than they do. So do you think there's a difference in expectation, that sometimes we expect them equal amount of things, but their language uses in different domains?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we can't really do this, but if you can take an adult and say, okay, you no longer have a job, you no longer have responsibilities, you can just play with your friends or whatever, and just talk with them, and you would learn a lot. But adults, they worry that I've got this job, I've got my family, I've got to take care of them, and so they're spending time, cognitive energy on other things. And so sometimes it's hard for them. The other thing that maybe is a little different with children and adults, typically children aren't worried about making mistakes. Adults often will be a little bit worried about that. And so there's maybe some anxiety. And so some affective issues. Once you start bringing those in, if an adult learner is worried, typically that shuts down learning. If you're anxious and you're worried, okay, people are going to laugh at me or I'm going to make mistakes, typically what that does is it interferes with learning. So to really be a good learner, language learner, you kind of have to be like a child in the sense that you're just going to have fun and you're going to make mistakes and it's okay. It doesn't matter. You're going to communicate and that kind of thing. So again, the approach that you take in the language learning environment makes a big difference. If you're really anxious, it's not going to go as well. So that's another important thing. The best language learners have high tolerance for ambiguity. They're just happy to be there and they're just going to soak up what they can, but they're not super anxious. So a good teacher is going to do what they can to create an environment where that anxiety is minimized and everyone feels comfortable. Because it's not uncommon in a context where you're learning, where you could have people that make a mistake and maybe someone laughs or something like that. And if people internalize that and say, oh no, I can't make a mistake, then it's going to be a problem for their learning.
Fascinating. It's definitely true, because I've seen people who got laughed at. Adults tend to be very self-conscious in their language, and I think that has a lot to do with pride as well. Not pride, but like as an adult, you're expected, as I said, expected other things as children than children. So you have to do all stuff, and it's kind of, in a way, humiliating to lower yourself to the standard of a child when learning a new language, especially as an adult.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that kind of anxiety shuts down learning. So I don't know why or exactly how that works, but basically learning will shut down, and you could be in a situation where you're in a class for an hour and you could learn nothing because you're worried. You're worried about what people are going to think. You're worried about making a mistake. So a really important thing for language learning in a classroom, and maybe in other contexts too, is getting to the point where you realize you're going to make mistakes and that's okay, and you're not worried about it. If you can get to that point and just feel relaxed and calm and just excited to learn, that's going to make a big difference.
And I was looking at one study they've done about corrective feedback. Can you tell me more about what that is and how that works?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research in what I call dynamic written corrective feedback. This is an area, so this is for people that are in academic contexts or professional contexts where they need to write at a certain level of accuracy. What I have found is, in my research, it's a challenge all the world over. It's like, how do you help people write accurately? Language learning is a long journey. And so often what will happen is they'll attend a writing class, they'll write 2 or 3 or 4 papers that maybe are 5 or 6 or 7 pages, and the teacher will write some feedback on them. And it might include feedback about organization and content and different things, as well as accuracy. And when I say accuracy, I mean what I would call linguistic accuracy, or word choice, grammatical accuracy, and mechanical accuracy. But the problem is, with just a little bit of feedback, it doesn't seem to make a difference.
Really?
They don't, and I think part of it is maybe they're learning something about the language. I'm a fan of skill acquisition theory. So I think of language learning a lot like music or sports. So I don't know. Do you do sports or music? Yeah. So let's take soccer for example. If all you did was, if you never practiced, and you had a team and they said, okay, let's go play. We're gonna play this tournament. It wouldn't go well, right?
No.
Because you're not really well prepared. So skill acquisition theory suggests that we need lots and lots of practice with feedback. And so with the writing, where we talk about accuracy, most accuracy issues are at the sentential level, or they're small chunks of language. So you don't have to write a 5-page paper to get feedback on accuracy. And because it's 5 pages, you can't write those all the time. You can't. And so what dynamic written corrective feedback does is it gives the students a chance to write a small piece because it's timed. So maybe 5 or 10 minutes, they produce a small amount of text. They get feedback on that, and then they write it again the next time. And they do that every day. And so the point is, over time, their accuracy improves. They become more aware. There's a cognitive load that we can carry, but if we're getting too much feedback, we're not going to learn anything. Mm-hmm. So it has to be the right amount of feedback. And if it's consistent over time, it's going to help them learn. And the accuracy issue, so some research I'm right in the middle of, kind of interesting. People improve in their writing in a lot of different ways. Writing is a multi-dimensional thing. It's very complex. And language use in general is. There's all these different pieces that have to come together. For some reason, the accuracy part of it seems to be less responsive to instruction and practice. It needs a little bit more. So rather than just saying, you're going to write these 3 or 4 pages of papers in a class and get a little bit of feedback, and you just keep making the same mistakes, repeatedly you work on the accuracy part in a different way than you would work on the organization and other things. And over time, we found that this is actually really helping people to write more accurately. Something that is lagging behind. I looked at a whole bunch of studies, and this is kind of an interesting thing. You have a treatment group and a control group, mm-hmm. and the treatment group improves. And in an educational context, you would expect the control group to improve just a little bit, but maybe the treatment group to improve even more. What I'm finding, though, is in a lot of cases, the control group doesn't improve, or it gets worse.
Really? Fascinating.
Yeah, wow. And I think the reason, I'm hypothesizing that the reason it gets worse is because they're actively learning all of these things, and the cognitive load is too heavy for them to attend to the accuracy part of their writing. They're learning new vocabulary. They're learning new content. They're learning new genre-based expectations for their writing and how to organize it and things like that. And so what happens is they can actually end up having less accurate writing over the course of an instructional period where you would expect it to improve. So I think that's just evidence that the accuracy needs to be attended to in a different way. It's a different construct, and you need to look at each of the pieces of the language that you're using and specifically identify, how do we develop this one the best? How do we develop this one the best? What does it need? Accuracy is one that I think you can break down into little chunks and practice over and over and over, and it will get better. But if you try to give a little bit of feedback just a few times in a semester on a paper, it's not going to really help them be more accurate. The point with skill acquisition theory is, if we're not regularly practicing with feedback, we're probably not going to get better. And so again, I look at language learning a lot like sports. And so if you're not practicing your sports, you're probably not going to play well when it's game time. But if you're practicing all the time, or practicing with music, you're going to do well. And so I think a lot of times we don't do enough of that in the classroom where we're practicing with feedback and getting better and better at what we do.
Like you said, always getting better and practicing feedback. And speaking of feedback, we are in the 2020s, 2025, and it's the age of AI. Now, how does one use? I've seen a lot of people using ChatGPT, for example, as a way to get feedback. How does one use ChatGPT to get feedback? Do you think it's a good way, not a good way? And you as a educator, you can tell me more about that.
So I think AI is great. I think there's more good there than harm. Obviously, AI is kind of a language model, so it actually produces language really well. I think it produces good examples. So it can be a really good tool for learners because it produces good examples of language. It's not always accurate, is my experience. So accuracy is a different question, but as far as language and how language is structured, it actually does a really good job. Another way that it can be used is, and this is being done right now and fairly successfully, it's evaluating the quality of writing. So we have automated writing evaluation tools. AI can function in that way. So it evaluates the writing. Is this good writing? Is it bad writing? Research that I've been just involved in and still involved in, though, with the dynamic written corrective feedback, part of what we do there is we mark the errors on their writing. What I found, though, is that the AI does not do a very good job of marking the errors accurately. So a teacher, and this is so far, right? So this is with the current AI tools that we have. Teachers mark the errors better than the AI so far. That probably will change because I'm hoping it will change because that will free up teachers to focus on other aspects of writing and not have to worry about marking errors. But for now, so the AI holistically can evaluate writing really well. It can produce good models of writing. But as far as identifying kind of error types that the students might make that they need to fix, it doesn't do a very good job with that. It gets them wrong. It misses them, especially at the lower proficiency levels where teachers still understand kind of what the students are saying. I think the comprehension, I'll put that in quotes, of the AI kind of breaks down. So I was hoping it would, because it's based on language, I was hoping it would do this task really well, identify the mistakes so that the students could then correct their mistakes and keep practicing with that. But it didn't do very well. And maybe it will in the future. But for right now, ChatGPT and several others are not doing as well as I'd like.
And if you were a student, right, and you were learning any language or English, how would they take advantage of AI or ChatGPT to be a better learner?
Yeah, I think having AI produce model text is a great thing to do. So, write something about this topic, and then the learner sees it, and you can see how it's structured. You can see how the sentences are structured and how it's organized. That's a really good thing. Now, of course, for me, the construct of writing, for example, is there's some different aspects to it. One is, writing a paper where you have multiple drafts and there's quite a process involved and you might get a lot of feedback. The other one is timed writing. So you sit down and you have 10 minutes or you have 30 minutes or you have an hour and you don't have any resources. So I think both of those are really important in writing development. But I think you can learn from the AI in terms of how writing is structured and because it does, I think, a very good job. But then you need to have context where you can't use the AI. You have to write yourself. You're not leaning on that. And it's timed writing, which is, a real world thing. In a job or in academics, we might have contexts where we have to write something quickly. Maybe we're in a testing center, we're taking a test, or maybe at work we have to send an email right away. And we may not have the luxury of having all these tools. So I certainly want to develop their own skills and not have them like AI to write things for them. But I think it's great when they're learning to see the patterns, the structures that AI uses, because it does a pretty good job of writing accurately, using nice sentence patterns. So it can be a teaching tool, but then we need to learn and then write without the resource.
One thing I do with my language learning, I've done this with specifically Arabic, is that I would have like a whole thing. AI would point out my mistakes, but then you're saying that, oh yeah, AI doesn't do a very good job at that.
I mean, it can, but as the proficiency decreases, it seems that it struggles. It doesn't. It knows something's wrong or might be wrong, but it's not sure how to mark it. So, and the way that the dynamic written corrective feedback works is you mark a particular error type, but you don't correct it. You let the student correct it. So this works pretty well for intermediate, mid to advanced high learners because they should know enough to be able to correct a lot of those mistakes. But AI struggled much more than teachers. It's not to say it didn't have some success, but it just didn't do very well compared to the teachers.
Dr. Hartshorn, to wrap it up, there is one couple final questions. Is what is the most misunderstood aspect of ESL teaching?
Yeah, I think we've kind of already talked about it a little bit, and that's that learning about language is the same as learning language. So, if you walk in a classroom and you go to the chalkboard and you start talking about the language, that is not language learning. Language learning is doing, engaging, acting, using the language, and that's what's going to help it develop. So again, it's not about what you know, it's about what you can do. And there are people that know a lot about English, sort of academically, but when it comes to talking, they really struggle. And I've seen students like that. We see that from students in Asia a lot, particularly Japanese, Korean students who actually know a lot about grammar. In some cases, they've studied really hard for many years, but they struggle to speak. So that's we really want them to focus is you use the language in the classroom. So that's I think a big thing is language teaching, language learning happens when we're using the language. And it's not what you know about the language; it's the using the language that counts.
Yeah, that was a great interview. Thank you so much for all your insight and all of your great knowledge that you just poured.
Well, it was a pleasure to talk with you, Felipe.
And that was Dr. Hartshorn. He's an amazing guy. Very, very good knowledge indeed. A lot of misconception about English teaching. And see you next time. Peace.